Good evening and welcome. My name is Ludovica Serratrice and I'm the current director of the Center for Literacy and Multilingualism at the University of Reading. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the fourth day of our Being Multilingual online series. I think many of you are already familiar with the center, CeLM, as we call it, because you have attended some of our events either in person or online. And for those of you who are new to our center, CeLM's mission is to conduct research, to engage with practitioners and the general public, and to train the next generation of researchers. Our research spans 5 broadly interconnected themes: language and literacy, education, migration, neuroscience, and health. And tonight we have 2 speakers, Christos Pliatsikas and Isil Bilgin, who will be sharing research on neuroscience. And I'm also very pleased tonight to be here with you because it's my opportunity to introduce to you your new director, Dr. Holly Joseph from the Institute of Education at the University of Reading, who will start in her new post in August. So Holly, over to you.
Thank you, Ludo. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. We're very excited to be giving this webinar today. And the theme of neuroscience. So this today's event, just like our other 4 events that some of you may have already attended, showcase the incredible variety of research that we do at CeLM, not only in terms of topic, but also in terms of approach, methodology and impact. And today in particular, you'll be hearing about interesting methodologies that are used in neuroscience. So I'm really delighted to introduce today's event. We have 2 fantastic speakers from our neuroscience theme, Isil Bilgin and Christos Pliatsikas. Sorry, Christos. Christos is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences, and his research focuses on experience-based neuroplasticity, with a primary focus on the effects of bilingualism, multilingualism on brain structure and function. And he uses behavioral and MRI methods to examine these questions. Isil is a PhD student from the Biomedical Engineering Department at Reading. Her research focuses on using mathematical methods to develop predictive models of the evolution of brain networks through learning new concepts. And today she'll be talking about what happens in the brain when we learn new words. So as you can probably see at the bottom of your screen, there are 2 options to interact with us. You can go into the chat and feel free to comment on what we're talking about or anything you want to mention during the talks. But if you want to ask the speakers a question, please don't put them in the chat, but rather put them in the Q&A section. So we'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout, and we hope that at the time we'll have, at the end, we'll have time to ask our speakers some of those questions. If not, we might just type the questions, the answers into the Q&A box, so keep an eye on it. So without further ado, I will pass over to our first speaker, Christos, who will give an overview of the neuroscience theme and talk a little about his own work. Thanks, Christos.
Thank you very much, Holly, and thanks for having me. So, as Holly mentioned, I am the lead of the neuroscience theme in CeLM, and our research relates to how learning and using multiple languages can affect cognition and the brain, but also what are the mechanisms that underlie this learning. So I have a presentation related to work from my lab, which I will share with you now. Until I do this, I want you to have your mobile phones at hand because I have a little exercise for you, a little task for you. Let me share the screen first. So Holly, can you confirm you see the full screen now?
Yeah, full screen, yeah.
Good, excellent, okay. So, as I said, Christos Pliatsikas, Associate Professor, and I will speak about the effects of bilingualism on our brains. The first thing that you may ask me, that I get asked in these talks usually, and you have probably asked it in other talks of this series, is that what is a bilingual? How we define a bilingual? And I won't give you an answer. This is where your little task comes in. I want you to enter this website and use this code, or scan the QR code below with your mobile phone. And this will take you to a small poll, 3 questions only, based on which we can discuss what we all think bilingual is. So I'll now share the screen of the results of your responses, which still has those details in the website that you need to enter. Just give me a second. Right, so you should be able to see, yes, I can see some responses coming in. So bilingual is someone with knowledge of 2 languages, that communicate in 2 languages, equally fluent in 2 languages, or born in a bilingual country. So these are your 4 options. And I can see, and I'm really glad to see, that you are very liberal as an audience in your description of what a bilingual is. So some people indeed believe that you're only bilingual if you're born in Wales, or you're equally fluent in 2 languages. But our research now moves towards a more different direction, and it still depends on who you ask in the field, but the vast majority of researchers consider someone to be bilingual when they can communicate in 2 languages. So we're on the same boat on this. I'm glad to see that. Let's move on to the next question then. How do you become bilingual? A very quick response here. So you're a bit more hesitant here, I can see. So the most popular response seems to be you become bilingual when you use 2 languages most of your time. I will remind you there's no right or wrong answer here, but I can tell you that, again, this is the direction that the field is moving towards. So over and over, we choose a more usage-based perspective, right? So you may spend a lot of time in a different country, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you use languages in a different country. You start learning your language early life. Yes, you can be an early bilingual, as we call them. But again, this depends on whether you actually use the language or not. Third and last question, I want you to select all statements that you agree with. Right. So what I see, I'm again pleased because you seem to appreciate the experience of bilingualism. You seem to appreciate it helps you understand cultures and improve your career prospects. There is some worry that it might not be helpful for children, that it makes children struggle at school or can get them confused. This is something that we hear a lot, especially from parents, and sometimes parents might interpret their children's behavior as an impediment if they're bilingual children. But hopefully by the end of this talk, we will convince you that this is not the case. Some people say it makes no difference to any of the above. I don't agree with that, but then we can discuss that towards the end of this talk. So let me go back to my main presentation. Let's stop sharing this and then start sharing the presentation. Is it full screen now? Just tell me if not.
Yeah, it is.
But excellent. Okay. So in order to understand the phenomenon of what a bilingual or a multilingual for that matter is, we need to think what happens when you become a bilingual. So if you already know one language, your native language, say, and you learn a second language on top of it, the first thing you do, which is quite obvious, is to learn new words for known meanings or known concepts. So what you see here is a small fairy animal, has 4 legs, tails, whiskers, and it meows, right? So this is the concept of a cat. And then in English, we have a label for it. We call it cat. If you learn German, you don't necessarily learn the concept all over, but you learn a new label for this concept, right? So if you learn German, you need to name this concept, this animal, Katze, because this is the linguistic label in the language of German. And this learning needs to take place on top of what you already know. You don't forget the English version of it. You just learn an alternative, let's say, a different label in a different language. So that's one of the first things that you learn, and that makes a lot of sense. But it's not just that. So what else happens? So I'm sure you recognize this lady here. This is Julia Roberts, a very famous actress. And then in English, her name is obviously Julia, and it's spelled in this way. The same name is spelled in the exact same way in many languages, in German and in Spanish and so on and so forth. However, it's not pronounced the same way. So if you were to pronounce this name in German, you would say Julia. And in Spanish, you would say Julia, right? This is simply because the same letter, J, has 3 different ways of being pronounced, different to each language, right? So it corresponds to different phonemes, as we would say in linguistic terms. So when you are a native speaker of English and you know that the letter J should sound like J, when you learn German, you also need to have in mind that if you speak in German, you need to pronounce it in a different way. And this will depend on the context that you are. Same if you learn Spanish, right? In this case, it should sound like ha. So this means that you have all this information learned somewhere, and then you need to choose which is more appropriate to use based on the concept that you find yourself in. What else happens when you learn languages? Well, if you learn Spanish or German, being a native English speaker, it's quite straightforward in the sense that all these languages use the same script, right? The Latin alphabet. However, different languages use different alphabets or scripts. So if you were to learn to write the concept of a cat in all these languages that you see on the right, Arabic, Greek, Georgian, Chinese, Thai, Russian, Hebrew, all these languages have their own script. So have their own symbols that correspond to sounds or phonemes, as we call them. So if you learn additional languages that have different script, not only you need to learn new labels for words, not only you need to learn new sounds or new phonemes, but you also need to learn new symbols. These are the letters and the sounds these symbols correspond to. What else do you learn? And this is possibly the most challenging thing for learners of additional languages. Different languages have different rules. So what you see here in the first example, you see a picture of a dog, and you can also see that it's a brown dog, right? So when you describe a picture like this, you have one word that describes what you see, dog, that we call a noun in linguistics. And you also have another word that precedes it, comes before it, which gives a property of your noun. So in this case, we have, well, our dog is brown. So this word, the adjective, tells us, gives us a property, the color of your noun, and it comes before the noun. The same way, the same picture in French would be pronounced in a different way. Here, your noun would come first, chien, and then the adjective that gives the color of this noun, brune, comes after it. So this is what we call word order rules, and they can be very specific and very strict in several languages. The same happens, the same differences you can find between English and German. So in English, you would say, I have eaten the apple. So the verb, or the word that describes the action, comes before the patient, as we call it, or the individual that receives the action. So the apple gets eaten, right? So the verb comes first, the action comes first, and then you have the patient. In German, the word structure is the sentence structure, sorry, is different. You would say, ich habe den Apfel gegessen. So what I've highlighted here, I've underlined here, is the verb. And in German, the verb comes at the very end of the sentence. So you will see that English, French, German have their own word order rules. There's no point discussing why that is, but what you need to know is that they can be really strict, really rigid. So when you learn languages, you need to learn those rules. Otherwise, if you scramble words, it might make no sense, or it would sound wrong in any case. Why am I saying all these things? The most important thing to remember is that all this information, different meanings, different sounds, different rules, is always active for all the languages that you speak. And it's always competing at any time. So this is my famous Fighting Julia slide, right? So an English-German speaker will always have all this information active. It's not that that you switch your language A in order to speak in your language B. Both languages are active, but you use the one that's appropriate to the context, as we have mentioned already. And this applies to all the properties of the language. Semantics, that is meaning, syntax, that is the word rules, the sounds, that's phonology, so on and so forth. So I like to make parallels of a tug of war of this, and I take myself as an example, right? So I'm an English Greek bilingual, well, Greek English more precisely, bilingual, and I live in an environment here where I need to use both of my languages, right? So obviously, I work in an English-speaking institution, so I teach in English, I supervise students in English, but I also have a Greek partner and Greek friends. So I'm using both of my languages pretty much in a balanced way. This means that they both remain active because, well, I need to know which, I need to have them at hand, depending on the person that I'm dealing with. And none of them really prevails. And how do I know they're active? Well, if we were in a real room now, I would pick someone that speaks Greek and I had a conversation with them. And I would ask them to switch between English and Greek and English and Greek. And you will see that it's not that difficult, actually. I can speak to you in English, και μετά μπορώ να σας μιλήσω στα ελληνικά, and then English again, και μετά πάλι ελληνικά. This shows that both languages are active and I can switch to them as I want, right? And I have this ability of switching to both of these languages because I'm an active user of both languages in my everyday life. However, there is a use it or lose it case to be made here. If I were to move back to Greece now, and then I started teaching in Greek, and then have the majority of my friends speaking Greek as well. So if my demands of using my English reduced, then my Greek would prevail, would become the dominant language. So it might be more difficult to switch to English, and I might start experiencing loss of my English, attrition, as we call it. So I might start forgetting words or expressions. So this is all down to active usage of the two languages, not just knowing language or having learned the language a few years ago. Why is that all important? You might have gathered by now that bilinguals face a challenging task, a difficult task that does not apply to monolinguals, really, right? So monolinguals don't have any of this competition of different languages. They don't have to worry about this. So bilingualism is a cognitively challenging task, but we don't really realize it. The question is, does it have any long-lasting effects on our cognition, our behavior, but also on our brain? I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the literature that says if you're older, you should do Sudoku and solve crosswords and do singing and gardening, so on and so forth, because all these activities help keep your brain young, right? Train your brain, keep it young, so on and so forth. Fair enough, this might be the case, but we should always remember that all these activities are leisure activities. You don't have to do them. You do them because you enjoy them, right? And one day you might do them, the next day you might forget about them and nothing will happen. Bilingualism is far from a leisure activity. You need to be an active bilingual if you are to survive in a country that is an immersive environment, in a country that you have to use your second language. So does this challenge pose any effects on the brain? So let's do a quick experiment together. I don't want you to speak out or do anything. What you will see now is a series of presentations of slides with some letters in them. And the letters will appear in different colors. All you have to do is each time read out the color, right? So as I said, do not unmute. We don't need to do this together. Just do it at your own pace. And then we will see whether some parts of this experiment were more difficult than others. Let's do it. Right. So you might have noticed there were three versions of this, or three conditions, as we call them in experimental psychology. The X's that appear in different colors, and we will ignore them for now. Then color words that appeared in the same color as the actual word. So the word red written in red letters. And then again, color words appearing in different colors. So the word blue written in red letters. If I asked you, you would probably tell me it was easier to say the color of this word, red, than the color of that word. This is simply because the color of this word matched the meaning of the actual word, right? This is what we call the congruent condition in psychology. Whereas in this case, the color of the word, red, did not match the meaning of the word, which is blue. And this means it takes you longer to say the color of the word, simply because you need to block the information that's not relevant. That is the meaning of the word. Remember, your task is just to say the color of the word, not the meaning of it. So saying red in this case takes a bit longer. It's more difficult for you. What we have seen is that bilinguals in such experiments, by the way, this is called the Stroop experiment. This is very common in psychology, are faster in saying red in this condition, as we call it, than monolinguals. Why is that? Well, bilinguals have long-term experience in choosing between alternatives, and they become really efficient in choosing what is appropriate or what is not appropriate in every context. So that applies here. This has nothing to do with choosing a language, but it has to do with choosing the appropriate stimulus and ignoring the non-appropriate stimulus. So bilinguals have been shown to be more efficient in doing this. So the question is, okay, we see these effects on cognition. Do we see effects on the brain as well? So what you see here is a brain scan, as the ones we acquire here in Reading. And actually, this is my own brain. And I'm happy to see this, full set, nothing is missing. What we know about the brain is that there is some specialization. Certain parts of the brain are specializing for certain skills. And we also know that learning and maintaining a new skill might affect how the brain works, but also the structure of a brain and those regions that underlie this skill. We know that from several studies. So we know that athletes here on the left have bigger volumes than non-athletes of the cerebellum, this part of the brain at the back, which is responsible for fine movement and balance and those things, which makes sense because athletes need more elaborate movement, need better balance, right? So this part of the brain increases. Similar results we have for taxi drivers. They have increased volumes of those parts of the brain that deal with navigation, which also makes sense because they need to be good at navigation, and also musicians that have shown increased volume in those parts that deal with music. What about bilingualism then? So what you see here, this is a template brain, not mine now. You see several parts of the brain that I have labeled that have been shown in the literature to change in structure and actually to increase in volume in bilinguals when you compare them to monolinguals. And these are not random parts of the brain. So these parts of the brain underlie all the different aspects of bilingualism. So learning new words, learning new sounds, learning new rules of languages, but also controlling between the two languages that you speak. Okay, so we do have structural effects. The brain reorganizes itself in order to deal with the demands of using more than one language. The question is, why should we care? So we said bilingualism is a long-term experience that might train the brain. You see that behaviorally or cognition. It might change the structure of the brain, but does that mean that it reinforces the structure of the brain? And what do I mean by reinforcing? There's a very well-known effect of aging that our brain shrinks as we grow older, right? There's nothing we can do about that. That's pure biology. If that's the case, what happens to those parts of the brain that we see increase in size if you're a bilingual. How does that play with these structures also decreasing in size as an effect of aging? So I have some very exciting results to show to you before I finish this talk. And this is from a recent study that we will submit for a publication very soon. So these are data from a large group of bilinguals, about 100 of them. And I will explain, this is a three-dimensional image, and I will explain each dimension separately to you. So what you see, the height of this box represents the volume of the codet. The codet is a structure in the brain that deals with language control, which is very important for bilingualism, obviously, right? So this is what you see. This is the height of the box. So the higher you have one of these boxes, the bigger the volume. This part of the box shows the age of our participants. So at the back of the box, you have 20-year-olds, and at the front, you have 50-year-olds. So the first thing to see is that 20-year-olds have higher volumes of the codet than 50-year-olds. Okay, so this is the effect of aging that I talked about. The codet will shrink as you get older. There isn't a lot you can do about this. However, what is really, really important is to see what happens on this dimension of the box. So this side of the box represents people that are practically monolingual, no bilingual experience at all, whereas this side of the box represents people with extreme bilingual experiences, and in this case, interpreters. So what this line shows is that with increased bilingual experience, so from 0 to 15, don't really need to know what these numbers mean, but with increased bilingual experience, the volume of the content increases, right? So it's very big for those with extreme bilingual experiences. However, note that the first row of these boxes, they're all 50-year-old people, right? So the 50-year-old monolinguals have volumes down here, whereas the 50-year-old bilinguals have volumes up there. So you will see that the difference in volume, as you can see in this axis, is dramatic. 50-year-old bilinguals have bigger codet compared to monolinguals. And also, if you look at this horizontally, you will see that 50-year-old bilinguals seem to have almost the same volume as 20-year-old monolinguals down here. So this is a very exciting finding, and tells us something about how bilingualism might counteract, as we say, neurodegeneration. So this comes back to the concept of neural reserve, and we have theories that say that lifelong usage of 2 or more languages leads to enhancement of executive control. This is practically what I told you about this task, so you are more efficient in such tasks, which in turn leads to neurostructural changes, and this process we call neural reserve. Another thing that bilingualism has been shown to do, which I won't go into detail today, is neural compensation. So in those patients that have lost brain tissue, for example, patients with Alzheimer's disease, you might find that their cognition is still intact, simply because bilingualism helps the brain reorganize itself and use whatever tissue is left to, again, perform the cognitive functions that it needs to perform, right? So what you see here on the right is a brain with Alzheimer's disease compared to a healthy brain on the left. But it might be the case that both brains have the same abilities when it comes to cognition, but this could be the case if the diseased brain on the right is the brain of a bilingual person. So you might have underlying disease, but if you're bilingual, this disease might not express itself in your skills. This brings me to the last slide of this presentation and the clinical implications of bilingualism. And we have evidence now to suggest that bilingualism might delay the symptoms of dementia by 4 to 5 years. Note, this is not a cure for dementia. This does not stop dementia. It doesn't, well, it simply delays the onset of the symptoms, right? So you are cognitively intact for longer. We also have evidence to show that bilingualism can lead to more successful recovery from stroke, less severe post-stroke aphasia, and we also have some tiny evidence that it creates similar effects in other diseases like Huntington's disease, Parkinson's disease, and multiple sclerosis. But this is still early days to talk about. Finally, my take-home message is, yes, people should learn languages. They can only do good for you, but they should also use the languages. And with that, I would thank you. These are the details of our lab. If you're interested in our research, so feel free to follow us in all these channels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christos. That was fascinating. I have lots of questions, but I won't ask you. So we'll pass now on to our next speaker. Isha, are you there? Brilliant. Do you want to share your slides? Fantastic. Okay, thank you.
I believe you can see it now.
No, we can't see yet. Yeah, now we can see. Yeah,
okay.
That's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So hi everyone, thank you very much for having me today. So I'm Isil Poyraz Bilgin. I'm a PhD student in biomedical engineering. I'm trained as a theoretical mathematician originally, and then later on I had neuroscience trainings, and now today I'm going to talk to you about how we merge those two different fields each other to make a more meaning of the brain research in a most exciting way. So let me just try to build upon what Christos was presenting. My study is all about learning novel words, but if we go back to what we mean by learning novel words, it's a lifelong process. Starts from the very early days of our lives and continues forever. And the intriguing thing about word learning is a thoughtful looking process actually happens quite naturally. For example, we learn words sometimes just by simply via our exposure to a discourse, or while we are listening to a podcast, or simply reading a newspaper article. So what happens through these exposures is simply, even being aware of we are doing such, our brain starts gathering the cues from the context that the words appear in. After each time we expose ourselves to this word, and our brain starts building this possible meaning representation among many other possible alternatives, just by using those cues in the context that the words appears in, and start narrowing down the options available and eventually create a meaningful representation of the unknown word. Here what you see is that if the target word here, the penguin, and we are just using it in a very basic narrative to give some features about the penguins. Eventually what we do literally create kind of a web around the web of words around the target word, and just by sharing those features, building one upon another. The interesting thing about this whole process is that human brain is evolved into such an amazing machinery, which makes this whole process so quickly and so efficiently just by using the necessary resources available. And if those resources are not enough, it's also have additional mechanisms to go back to its previous stored information and use those some inferential mechanisms to guess about the meaning. So what's all these inferential mechanisms about? Although we learn words as separate entities, our brain secretly runs a classification algorithm to organize the concepts that those words refers to into meaningful categories, just based on the similarities or overlaps of the features those concepts have. So if you look at the diagram here, what you simply see in the most coarse level, of course, our brain understands that some objects can be categorized under living versus non-living groups just based on the animacy of in them, and then some subgrouping comes again based on some shared features among those objects. How these categorizations help us in learning a novel word? So simply, when a novel word is encountered, exactly the same process applies. So our brain looks at the commonalities or similarities between the concept that this new word refers to with the existing words we already know, and try to find best fits with the this novel word versus the existing words, and it makes the learning process more quicker, easier, and more intact. Hence, the categorization, in a way, works as an initial filtering mechanism of the brain, where it adjusts the amount of attention, hence the workload it will put onto learning a new concept that words represent to. What I'm going to do now, so I will just ask you to use the chat and just to tell me among which of those three objects, which are actually non-existent, they are coming from a study by Clark et al. So they are made-up objects called Gegi, Eti, and Reda. I just want to make you a wild guess, just initiating the name that you think of that object is made of metal. So I don't know either, so we will reveal it and learn it together. So I will just give you 2 minutes time. And I will ask you to just enter whatever you think. Okay, so I see some coming. So I see Rida. Okay, okay. Okay, thank you. There are quite a lot of Gigi and Rida. Okay, let me reveal which one is. So apparently, whoever said Gigi made a right decision, because we learn now that Gigi is made of metal and the others made of other materials. Now let's look at the another feature. So which among those objects you think there is found in airports? So again, make a wild guess, because we don't know. There is no evidence or any clue that we might guess. Okay. Okay, again, Rida or Gigi is guessing. Okay, thank you. Eti, and I can see an Eti and Rida guessing. Okay, let's reveal and learn then. So apparently this time whoever said Eti made a good guess, because we know that it's found near pods. And if I just reveal another feature simply, now we know that we all have 3 different features about those totally made up and non-existing objects, but now they have some sort of representations in our brain and have 3 different features already. And now if I just ask you, present you this new object and give you these 2 features about this object and ask you which another object you already learned is associated with theta, then I'm sure you will be easily say that Eti and theta might be in the same category. This is exactly what we did in this 2-3 minute time, is actually kind of a representation of how we learn words in time, and then how the categorization mechanisms work in our brain and helps us to learn even more and better. Now we have kind of a rough idea about the theoretical aspects of word learning. Let me just show you a little bit more about how the anatomy of word learning works. What you see here are on the left is basic schematic of how brain areas how the different brain areas works when we process a word. So there are many accounts on how word processing or meaning is encoded and stored in the brain. So some accounts claim from birth we have anatomically specialized units and systems, what we call sensory modality specific regions in the brain, that are specifically to processing certain semantic features associated with, here, as you can see, the word forms or sound, motion properties, shape, color, action. So we see this different distributed nature of the different aspects of the objects or words or concepts that words represent. Or some other accounts believe that brains still have such distributed nature in processing different semantic features. However, it also has some dedicated areas in the brain, act as a hub regions, unify those different features, semantic features together, create some combinatorial meaning representations for the word. The evidences of this distributional view of semantic information processing also comes from the research run on patients with semantic dementia and Alzheimer's disease, in which the patients showed loss of metabolism in the indicated those gray areas, hence the loss of ability to name the words from some specific categories for semantic dementia patients and degradation of semantic memory in patients with Alzheimer's disease, which is also considered as an early onset of the identification of the disease. However, we know that these patients do not lose all of their language abilities. So they still now shows intact processing of basic level comprehension and retrieval of the information from other words or objects from the other categories, or they can still understand sentences, or they can still bring some memories back. However, some part of the semantic knowledge shows some level of degradation. So this shows us the language system is not localized only on a single area, but distributed all around the brain. And hence, damage to a certain area only causes the loss of abilities associated with this particular area in the brain, but the rest of the language processing still stays intact. In the further processes, we also know that with therapies and treatment, helps the other intact areas in the brain to act as a backup mechanism to help those patients to regain some skills and abilities. This is the coarse level distribution of semantic processing in the brain, but we also know that if you want to look at the more finer level processing of the words in the brain. This is one of the most seminal works in the neurolinguistics that is run by Jack Gallant and his lab from the Berkeley University. What you see here is that a color-coded map of the brain activities that is elicited to the listening the words that passes in a radio show that is presented to the participant lying inside the scanner for several hours, and they captured the brain function when they were listening to those radio shows. The colors represent here that just by looking at the chart over here, if we classify the words that passes in this radio show into categories like visual or tactile, time or social, etc. So the colors here represent the activations mapped in this cortical surface based on the whatever this word was processed at this particular time frame. As you can see here, how the processing and information from a different category is spread all over the brain, because the concepts have many semantic aspects to bring together to form a meaning, and therefore we see many different areas to come together to create those meaningful representations again in the brain. If this is the case, which means that we cannot think each brain as acting as a single unit. They have to be in a very orchestrated way, acting all together to create those representations. So what you see here, the dots represent those different brain regions we saw earlier. And the links actually not exist, but it's just for visualization purposes, shows the this region might be highly communicating for this region, or this region might be highly communicating with this region just to whatever task is accommodate to whatever task is doing. And the image on the left-hand side shows the state of the brain before the learning, and the right-hand side shows the the organization of brain into a completely new structure after the learning occurs. This data comes from my own data. I will share with you in a minute. So if you look at the right-hand side of the image, what happens here that you see some regions drop from the process, which means they become inactive because the task doesn't require them to be active in this process anymore. And you see some other new regions comes into the play. And also you see some regions becomes getting together and start talking more frequently and regularly, and create some sort of community that we call in the mathematical understanding. What this means in the mathematical domain is that human brain and the network across the regions in the brain shows a plastic nature, which means it organizes itself in a new topological structure to accommodate the different information to be processed or to fulfill the task demands for successful completion of a task. For example, the learning requires some attentional mechanisms to come into the play. Because our brain wants to be attentive to the cues from the environment to grab the meaning. So we see some attention mechanisms to create their own small community. Or we see some, because we introduce here where the penguin lives and how it looks like, we start seeing some areas associated with the color coding or visual information encoding or habitat related areas start activating in the brain and start talking more with each other. And also we see the unification or we call associative hubs also start becoming more active to unify those different regions with each other to just create intact representations. So based on all this information that we learned so far, let me talk about my research question then. If the processing of a word meaning requires those different regions in the brain to come together and work collaboratively, then our question here is that can we observe the emergence of those neural representations in the brain while there is no representation exists and after learning? And more specifically, can we observe the evolution of this reorganization of the brain itself into a more efficient and more organized way that will accompany the representation of successful learning? To be able to answer that, we run a set of experiment using two different imaging modalities. One is called electroencephalogram, using a set of electrodes installed into the skull and collecting electromagnetic signals from the brain that is created by some chemical activities going on between the neurons and turn into some meaningful signals and also topological maps. The other one is called functional magnetic resonance imaging, which simply does is it uses the magnetization properties of the blood runs into the veins inside of the brain and turns into some meaningful layered images and also some time signals, and we analyze further from there onwards. So my participants simply lied inside the scanner, installed this cap on their head and gone through some learning tasks in which they had to just read those 3 sentences about the objects, totally new objects. They are not exist in the world, but they are not exist. We just want to ask them to read those sentences, try to keep those semantic features in your mind, and then we will also ask you some questions and just try to answer them as much as you can remember. We had null animals, a set of null animals, and we also had some counterparts, real animals, just for the statistical purposes, for the later on analysis. And after each training is done, we repeated the sentences 6 times, just for the powerful representations to occur, because we know repetition also helps with the learning successful learning. We ask them some questions, very simple questions for them to answer using a button box saying yes or no. So let's talk about the results then. Here what you see on the left, the accuracy of the answers across time of learning to the novel words versus real words. As you can see here, maybe in the very early stage, we call this stage as a kind of a task learning or just getting used to the button box. But after that, we see some pain starts for the novel words and they start learning the novel words in time. But for the real words, we see it's almost stable because they already know the concepts. They are more comfortable and they already have this knowledge. It's just for them to retrieve the information and answer the questions rather than learning to occur. Therefore, we see this behavioral measure of the successful learning already. So then from this onwards, we have to look how the brain functioning works. So what you see here we call topological maps we obtain from EEG analysis. As you can see, we introduced 3 different features about the objects, and each introduction for novel words created some different polarity in the brain, more negativity in the frontal areas and more positivity in the posterior areas in the brain. But in time, we see some change happening, and for real words, we see almost a stable topological distribution in the brain, but for novel words, we reach to a state, it's almost similar state with how the real words were anyway in the first place. So this means that we see some topological evidences of the change in the brain dynamics across time going towards the learning to get its finalization state. If you look at the FMRI results, so we use the FMRI data for establishing our brain networks, which means that what you see here, each dot again represents some brain regions, and this is before the training starts. So at the very early onset of the training, we see quite a lot of activation going on in the brain because the brain tries to compensate this incoming new information and tries to all the brain mechanisms as possible to become attentive to those details and cues become highly active. But after training occurs, we see brain activities and the networks becomes more sparse, more similar to how the real world network is, and becomes more efficiently organized into smaller units rather than all over the brain, which is kind of showing us the evidence that brain starts organizing itself into a more efficient and more stable position rather than ongoing learning state. This is also showing us the result the learning becomes more intact, and network shows us the plasticity of the brain in small time. As conclusion, what we see so far, brain activations shows a distributed fashion to accommodate those different semantic features that are associated with the meaning of a word. Encoding the meaning of a novel word requires the coherent activation or communication between those distributed brain areas. Hence, the brain organizes itself eventually into the most efficient state to accommodate encoding novel information alongside already existing knowledge. What about more languages? The meaning of concepts, so just going back to what Christos was telling several minutes ago. So yes, maybe the meaning of concepts or words might slightly be different from one to another. in different languages, but eventually how the brain works, how it organizes those different concepts into different categories, or how it anatomically uses those resources available in the brain, relies on exactly the same mechanisms independent of the what the language is all about. I just put a very their food or bakery that we have in Turkey. I'm from Turkey originally, so simit. We call it simit. You call I guess bagel. So the bagel, it just maybe represents a bakery in English, but in Turkish it's kind of a food. Usually, especially when you don't have so much money, but you always at reach, and it kind of represents the honorable life in Turkey. So it has a deeper, of course, discussion to make it more elaborate for you. But this is all I wanted to say about my research. So this is my, I'm of course principal investigator and my team that I work with. And I just want to thank you for the opportunity. And I guess this is all I want to share with you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for two wonderful talks. One thing I'll say about neuroscience researchers is they always have beautiful slides. I think that's a big advantage of being a neuroscientist. So we have about 3 minutes. I think Ludo has a question she might kick us off with.
Thank you, Christian and Jill. Exciting work being done itself. Christos, I just had a question for you. You did touch upon this issue in your presentation when you're talking about different types of bilinguals and, you know, how the kind of lived experience of bilinguals can affect what happens at the functional, the structural level. Can you talk us a little bit more about the effects of code switching on these cognitive correlates of bilingualism, whether, you know, people that use their languages in different ways have got different repercussions when it comes to the brain?
Well, we don't know yet, because it has not been studied yet at that level of detail. So there is some evidence, at least at the behavioral level, that different types of code switching, so choices that whether you insert languages from, you know, language A into sentence B, might have a behavioral effects. We don't know yet when it comes to the brain level, but there is, we have good reasons to believe that this would be the case. And I guess, well, actually, we do have some data we haven't analyzed yet. So this graph that I showed about aging, we also have measurements of amount of frequency of code switching. So we are planning to use them to see how they predict those changes. But the only thing I could predict / speculate now would be that the greater the amount of code switching, the greater the demands you pose on your brain, the bigger the adaptations you will see at the functional and structural level. But stay tuned.
So there are a couple of other questions, but just to follow on from that, Christos, in this sort of graph that you presented, it looked like for the interpreters who were the extreme kind of bilinguals, the curve went down a little bit. And so I was wondering whether actually that's not the kind of ideal kind of bilingual, if you like, and if it actually being a little bit more of a, I don't know, typical everyday bilingual is actually better for your brain than
not necessarily. So this touches upon an issue that I didn't expand on. So the brain cannot, well, expand forever, right? It won't get bigger forever. So the brain gets bigger because it needs to try different connections to make its function efficient. But if you have too many connections at the same time, it becomes too demanding when it comes to energy resources, because the brain needs energy to function. So after a certain level, we find that the brain is capable of, I mean, after it's grown those structures, right? Keep those connections that do the job, and then get rid of all the connections, all the parts of the neurons that are superfluous, are not needed anymore. So it creates all these connections, it grows and grows and grows and grows, but not all of them prove to be useful. So it keeps the useful ones. And these are still more than what it was originally. But these very useful ones are the ones that are very efficient, and these are the ones that don't age as quickly as they would do. That's why you see this drop, which we call renormalization, but I didn't have time to go into many.
Okay, thank you. I've just two questions in the Q&A. One is about will the recordings of the talks be available? Yes, they will. We'll put them on our YouTube channel. We haven't done that yet, but we will soon. And then just one more question for both of you. And so let's just ask you, Isil, since you haven't had an opportunity yet. Are there differences in the processing of oral and written language in the brain?
Yes, there are, but just in terms of how we process this input at the very first stage of processing. So we have some specific areas in the brain associated with auditory processing or visual processing. And when the entry point is either of them, we see the first activations in the very early onset of those processing starts from these areas, and it moves towards those linguistic areas that I showed you in the several slides. You can just think of them as a kind of entry point of the brain, and the stream then organizes itself to accommodate the best and most efficient way to create the meaningful and compact organization. But after those entry points, actually the processing is almost the same. It's just maybe just expectation related areas might be coming, or if you are reading because you will be starting doing some eye movement, these kind of activities we might be observing, but other than that, the rest is completely the same process.
Thank you. Now some more questions have come up, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So maybe we'll try. Do you want to ask one, Ludo? Go on then.
No, I'm just saying maybe we can. I think there may be relatively quick answers to those ones. I don't know, Chris, if you want to take maybe those.
I will be very quick. So the question by Maria, well, yes, sorry, I wrote the wrong one, sorry. The question by Katie first. Well, to a certain extent, yep. So, but we have seen in bilinguals that learn a third language, there is a kickstart of this processing again. So you have more structural changes happening as you get a third or a fourth language, but not the same magnitude. So it seems that the whole system has been optimized to a certain extent, but then you might have some changes when you start learning another language. So Maria's question now, I got it right this time. We know that brain plasticity exists whether you're 20 or 50, right? But again, it comes down to actual usage, right? So yes, when the longer you have the two languages, the more pronounced those effects will be. So if you learn at the age of 20 but never use it, you might have less effects than a 50-year-old that learned the language and used it for 10 years non-stop.
Great, thank you. And then we just had our last comment is just saying thank you, and it's been very insightful, so that's lovely. Okay, so sorry to go 3 minutes over, everyone. You've still got plenty of time to prepare for the football match at 8. Thank you to our speakers. It's always great to have neuroscience explained in a way that you know, non-neuroscientists can understand, so thank you so much. And to everybody here, do join us for our final event next Wednesday, which is health. So it has a lot of relationship actually to what Christos was talking about. So lots about dementia and other sort of neurological conditions that affect language, and also developmental language disorders. I think there are some speech and language therapists in the audience that might be particularly interested in that. Yeah. Thank you very much. Bye. Okay. See you next week. Bye.